told me, don't preface things. But I'm going to anyway. Do you know she's gone to, is it Union Theological Seminary? But really she's just gone because Cornell West is going to be teaching a class next semester. I heard through the grapevine. And I just love that so much. This talk is going to be rather political, but it definitely is inspired by the theme of the month. And so if my thread is not strong enough to show that, I just want to preface it to say, please keep that in mind, that it's definitely coming from that place. The other day, Sonia and I were discussing my uncle, who had just come to visit from Montana. He's a devout Seventh-day Adventist. Suffice it to say, he doesn't believe in being immunized against COVID-19. While Sonia and I discussed how it is that many people in our community have such strong convictions running counter to our own beliefs, she admitted to me that sometimes she wonders if we are wrong. At this, I became quite animated. Yes, we are wrong, I told her, because to see the world in a scientific manner means to know that your understanding of the world isn't perfect. It will have flaws. Eventually, new information will show us that the way we understand the world is incorrect, or at least not wholly correct. Science, based on the data that we collect, uses the math of statistics to determine how likely something is to be true. Around this uncertainty, we describe the world and the way it works to the best of our ability. And we're only right to a certain degree of uncertainty. Of course, the questions scientists allow themselves to ask and the data they find themselves able to collect are both deeply influenced by their position within a culture. Despite its inherent imperfections, then, as a human endeavor, the scientific approach has allowed humanity to develop a more objective dialogue about our world. In a sense, it allows us to take the world less personally. The Dalai Lama has pointed out how this critical approach to reality gives scientific thinking and Buddhism much in common. The scientific approach to knowledge centers doubt. The rise of scientific thinking influenced an erosion of people's faith in traditional social and political structures. Europe's turbulent history during the Reformation built up synergistic doubts between traditional views of religion and political hierarchy, resulting in Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. The effects of these transformational ideas reached a fever pitch during the French Revolution. Reason demanded that justice be enacted through the Reign of Terror. The king and queen had their heads removed, and Notre Dame Cathedral was renamed the Temple of Reason. Without a doubt, the Enlightenment ideals failed to result in a stable and harmonious society in France, following what had been the necessary break from a system of oppressive monarchy and corrupt clergy. The revolutionaries ended up eating their own, and the ultimate result was the dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte. The new empire of France under Napoleon was, however, one of reason and science, but to the benefit of the emperor. It is a critique of this turning of the people's emancipatory purpose to the benefit of an imperial power structure that I would like to center in my talk today. This dynamic has played out again and again throughout history. Those who wish to take or maintain power are prone to co-opt the virtues of the people's wisdom. This pattern of people in power aligning themselves with the spiritual sensibilities of the oppressed was as true in ancient Mesopotamia as it was last summer in 2020, when multinational corporations who exploit the labor of people of color around the world put out messaging which attempted to portray their organizations as aligned with the struggle for racial justice. Spirituality can be thought of as the search for ultimate or sacred meaning and purpose in life. This search has overlapped with the political reality of human societies, likely from the beginning of our species. We are a social animal, individuals relying on the group for mutual assistance and support. Within our unity arises our purpose to thrive together. The meaning that we draw from this struggle cannot help but suffuse the processes of decision-making and social organization. It is no surprise that the earliest kings and emperors identified themselves with their people's gods, or even as gods themselves. Keep in mind that the various layers of separation between spirituality and politics in the modern age are always in dynamic tension, influencing and feeding off of each other in surprising ways. The process of analyzing and critiquing the systems of power cannot help but grapple with the spiritual. Enlightenment thinkers of the 1700s had voiced their doubts with the church and the monarchy, but a deeper doubt about the broader functioning of human society developed during the 1800s in the writing of Karl Marx. This critique of capitalism sought to be more scientific in its approach to understanding how people are exploited by systemic forces within society. Marx envisioned a communist society, a world where the give and take of people's needs and wants would be in balance with their natural gifts and abilities. This society would be managed and maintained by a philosophically enlightened populace, an absolute democracy, where there would be no need for hierarchies, including religions, that would draw unnecessarily upon the resources that humanity would provide for the collective good. These beautiful ideas presented themselves as the perfect spiritual justification for the hosts of atrocities carried out under the Bolsheviks, Maoists, Khmer Rouge, and other regimes in the name of historical progress. As an aside, most people don't understand the philosophical ideas that define the term communism and conflate the word entirely with those totalitarian regimes that chose to use the term and its ideals as a front for their own efforts to amass power. It reminds me of another modern society where the values of peace and justice have all too often been used as a front for those in power to accumulate and consolidate control. After the horror of the Second World War, a group of secular Jewish philosophers who escaped the Holocaust refined their ideas about society, culture, politics, and, most importantly, power, creating the foundation of the academic discipline known as critical theory. They were all Marxists in the sense that they agreed with Marx's identification of the problems of exploitation within capitalist societies. But they approached their critique of capitalism with 100 years of added insight from social science, psychology, anthropology, and literary criticism. They were looking at the ways in which capitalism functioned in the fully modern age. This group of thinkers, known as the Frankfurt School, identified how the inherent failures in capitalism's structure gave rise to fascism. A fascinating aspect of fascism is the way it uses the language of spirituality. While both nihilistic and deeply spiritual, fascist regimes sanctify their pursuit and consolidation of power with ritual and religious imagery. The Frankfurt School was also critical of the Stalinist regime's monstrous wielding of power in the name of egalitarian ideals. As the Frankfurt School thinker Theodor Adorno said, abstract utopia is all too compatible with the most insidious tendencies of society. The ideals of communism could definitely be described as spiritual in that they were again a search for ultimate or sacred meaning and purpose in life. Sacred certainly in the sense that those who used these beliefs to gain power were willing to make any sacrifice necessary to bring society into an ideal state. The influence of critical theory within the social sciences cannot be understated. Critical theory works to reveal and challenge power structures. Intellectuals of the late 20th century were inspired to abandon some traditional ways of conducting philosophical discourse. I should say some intellectuals. Being inspired to abandon traditional ways of conducting philosophical discourse in order to gain distance and perspective on the systems of power which created and benefited from those traditional methods. Postmodern philosophy thereby developed out of critical theory. Again, however, we're seeing the postmodern ideas of simulation and relativization of truth being harnessed by conservative forces in ongoing efforts to maintain control over society. Just think of Giuliani stating that truth isn't truth, and that nowadays facts are in the eye of the beholder. Inherently contradictory conspiracy theories are formed online which function as an alternate reality for conservative Christian Americans who are organically simulating a world which better suits their psychological rejection of the left. These conspiracy theories are full of spiritual language and imagery. The central and most important postmodern reframing of truth by those with power is the projection of the global and corporate elite as being inherently socialistic. In a sense, this simulation is one which is taken on by both the political left and right, with corporations and liberal elites paying lip service to progressive ideals while manipulating the system to maintain the dominance of capital. And conversely, conservative groups, including some of the same corporations, claiming that the left is staging a socialist takeover. Critical race theory, the boogeyman of the political right today, uses critical theory to investigate the ways in which structures of power perpetuate racism in society to the benefit of those who are in power. The development of critical race theory was anti-liberal in the sense that it is critical of the ways in which the superficial gains made by the civil rights movement in the 1960s were undermined by more subtle and systemic forms of racism. Ultimately, critical race theory tasks itself with tackling the ways in which our liberal society uses its legal framework and its ideals of individual rights and the free market to perpetuate a system in which the benefits go to those who are already privileged and powerful. The very construction of race as a category with all its historical baggage results in circumstances where people of color are not provided with the same freedoms and opportunities as those who can pass as white. So how does spirituality fit within the contemporary political landscape? The academic storyteller David Bohe said that for spirituality to gain any right to exist, it must be critical of spiritual abuse. And for spirituality to have any right to exist, it must be critical of its attempt to ignore the history of spiritual barbarism. If we're going to be spiritual and seek justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, as our second UU principle states, we must be critical of the ways in which spirituality is co-opted and commandeered by empire and by capital to serve the interests of those in power. Spirituality sanctified the genocide of Native people and the conquest of this continent. Spirituality gives legitimacy to ongoing perpetuation of militarism in our culture. Spirituality sanctifies the hate and exclusion of LGBTQ+ people. Today we see spirituality being used within powerful corporations to sanctify the leadership and management of those institutions, irrespective of the fact that their drive is to make money and not to seek justice and equity. Holding a sense of spirituality may allow individuals and groups to absolve themselves of the need to reflect on current issues. If one believes themselves to be properly spiritually aligned, it may not seem necessary to identify the problems in the world and help alleviate the suffering around them. The detachment which can come with a spiritual mindset allows some people to detach from the need to care and to give compassion. I see this problem occurring in both the conservative Christian community as well as New Age spiritual communities. When we start thinking in terms of critical spirituality, it becomes clear that holding spiritual beliefs from the safety of our privileged lives here in the Mountain West cannot stop at the level of abstract ideals, but must spur us to action. To quote David Bohe again, the question is, how is love thy neighbor as thyself put into practice? What ought our spiritual convictions move us to do in the present political climate? This question, I hope, is a good topic for discussion, and I hope something of an inspiration for action.